Lookaftering by Autumn Astra. Chapter 1. Here Before. Once you're real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always. The Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams. Lancelot stood in the middle of a field. There was a dreamy sort of haze that covered everything. It covered the sunset pinkened sky, the grass that swayed gently in the breeze. The air smelled sweetly of the impending night and a coming storm. It was nice. It was always nice to get out. The museum was lovely, but it could feel like the walls were closing in sometimes, and that it didn't always sit well with Lancelot's inherent drive to explore. The world was so big, bigger than he could have possibly imagined. He was just meant to stay in one place forever? He had no idea how the others had done it for so long. A particularly strong gust of wind shook everything around it. Indeed, he should like to bring his companions from the museum here. Perhaps they would enjoy it. Why do you keep coming here? Lancelot turned to the source of the sudden echoing voice. A young boy stood before him, and despite the lack of a discernible face or form, he knew who this was. All of my loved ones are here. 'Tis the only place I can truly see you all, Lancelot answered. That's right, he'd been here before. Last time it had been Galahad, and Guinevere before that. The boy tilted his head. You know you are dreaming. I do. None of this is real. I know. But you are real now. You have been for many years, and yet you choose to inflict heartache upon yourself time and time again. Why? Lancelot smiled, bittersweet. Real people love quite strongly, I'm afraid. I can't seem to move on. You... Oh, Galahad, stop it. Just come here. The boy, Galahad, ran right into Lancelot's open arms and clung to him tightly. Lancelot had never gotten to see his son this small. He certainly would have liked to. A new wave of heartbreak and mourning crashed over his soul like a rogue wave, sending him to drown, and Lancelot held Galahad just as tightly, fearing the inevitable moment he would awake, and this would all be gone. You cannot stay forever, Galahad said, as if he could hear Lancelot's thoughts. You must wake up soon. I wish I would not, Lancelot murmured. There is a life that is waiting for you. You must. Will I see you here again? Lancelot jolted awake. Another night descended upon the museum, and an explosion of excitement cascaded throughout the halls. Tonight was the introduction of some new exhibits. Normally, Lancelot might be exploring them curiously, though that dream had soured his mood, so instead he stomped over to the front desk and sat down to sulk. It would be a lie to say he hadn't always considered himself to be a little unlucky. Even in all those glorious stories of his life, things always seemed to go wrong for him, and evidently, that was still very much the case. Even when he was starting to have a good time, the dreams of long-lost loved ones had to haunt him. Everything always felt like waking up for the first time, but with all the knowledge and experience of a man who had been alive for hundreds of years. Never before had he actually had to experience real heartache, even though all those memories felt very real. They always felt real, every single one, despite the fact that he could never actually see their faces. Aquanra had tried to help him figure that one out a while ago. The conclusion ultimately ended up being that, because there is no one true telling of the story, there is no one true look for anyone. Guinevere could look exactly like that Alice Eve lady back in London, or she could look entirely different, and Lancelot would never remember. It was, to say the least, a very harrowing thought to come to terms with. Lancelot looked up at the computer in front of him. The screen was switched off, and in it he could see his reflection. Whispers of memories came back, people remarking on how strikingly similar his son had looked to him. He had scratched his beard and tried to imagine a young boy with his face, softer. Maybe he had his eyes. How strange. Parts of his memory didn't even know Galahad. The boy was like a ghost in the fog, only vaguely visible if you were really looking. Are you all right, lad? The booming voice of Teddy startled Lancelot from his thoughts. The former president was looking down at him from his horse with a furrowed brow. Oh, yes. Quite all right, thank you. Lancelot smiled up at him. Teddy didn't seem very convinced. It's not healthy for a man to mope about so often. You ought to open up about what's eating you. What? Mope? Lancelot scoffed. I don't mope. Moping is for people who aren't me. Are the circumstances of your existence still bothering you? Well, it hadn't been presently, but it never helped when people kept bringing it up. No, this was one of those odd occasions when the considerable lack of existence of his loved ones was bothering him. Lancelot frowned as he tried to figure out how to explain that. You were once a father, were you not, Sir Theodore? Lancelot asked rather suddenly, and Teddy looked surprised. I was. Do you miss them? Of course. How do you handle their absence? There was a look of understanding that spread across Teddy's face. For a very long time, I tried to avoid thinking of them. It was hard, you understand, but once I started to allow myself to mourn, it stopped hurting to remember them. Lancelot nodded slowly. It was fine advice, but he wasn't entirely sure it was exactly what he was looking for. Not that he held Teddy at any fault. This was a peculiar situation. Thank you, sir. Lancelot, there you are. Both Lancelot and Teddy looked up to see Nick jog into the room. He looked rather frazzled. Lancelot raised a brow. You've been looking for me? Lancelot asked. Yeah, Oh, hey, Teddy. Waya was asking where you were, Nick said. Teddy made a bit of an alarmed sound, like he just remembered something. It was good talking to you, lad. I must be off. As the pair watched Teddy ride off, and Nick explained, the Lewis and Clark exhibit was updated. They gave Sacagawea her baby. I guess Teddy offered to help her out. Truly, Lancelot felt very happy for Sacagawea. She must have been overjoyed. Though, given the current circumstances, he only felt a little bit jealous. Just a little. How lovely. Yes, anyways, I had something I needed to show you. Nick looked excited. It definitely piqued Lancelot's curiosity. Is someone in need of assistance? Saving? Lancelot asked. No, but it's still cool. As much as Lancelot had wanted to sit and stew in his thoughts for the night, he wasn't immune to being needed for something. A distraction wasn't totally unwelcome either. Very well, lead the way. Shit, is it okay if we make a detour real quick? Or I guess you could wait here? I just remembered I asked for Ock's help with the new miniature diorama. He's probably waiting for me. Nick had spun around on his heel to face Lancelot, an apologetic look in his eye. Lancelot considered just waiting, but he'd be lying if he said he wasn't endlessly fascinated by those comically tiny people. I shall accompany you still. Just as Nick had suspected, Aquenraw was present, crouching in front of a new in-wall exhibit. Upon seeing the pair enter, he stood to greet them. I took the liberty of starting the introduction, Ock explained. Javier is currently in there explaining everything. He's been a tremendous help in translating. The informational plaque on the wall read, The Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. Inside, the strange little cursed man that Lancelot recognized from the American West diorama was standing before a small crowd. The individual at the very head of the gathering kept adjusting their gun in their hands as Javier spoke. The action was evidently not lost on Javier, whose eyes darted to the weapon every time it moved. Have there been any problems? Nick asked. There was a bit of gun waving, though I suppose it's understandable that they're frightened. I'm certain it'll get all sorted out now, however. That's good. Would you be willing to oversee? Nick made a broad gesture towards the diorama. Some of the inhabitants flinched away slightly at the sudden movement. Sorry, I know it's not your job. I'll check back later. I just have so much stuff to do. Aquenraw fixed Nick with an amused look. I shall not. It is of great offense to me that you should even ask. Nick looked unamused. Of course I will. Aquenraw delivered a playful slap to Nick's shoulder. Then he looked at Lancelot. Honestly, I've known him since he was 10, and he still acts like I'll fall over and die if I have to do one thing sometimes. Lancelot often forgot that many of the museum's inhabitants had known each other that long, and some for even longer. The time he'd spent getting to know Aquenraw those 3 years in London had been informative to that fact. He'd learned so much about people he'd never met. It was incredibly clear that they all considered each other family, and privately, Lancelot hoped that he was now included in that. You sure act like you will sometimes, Nick retorted, which earned a rather offended look from the king. Thank you, though, seriously. I'll be back. Come on, Lance. Lancelot watched new faces pass by curiously. He'd come to be endlessly fascinated by how much the world had changed since his time. It was always a treat to speak with those eager to share stories from their time alive, or to hear the passion they held for their culture. Lancelot often tried to offer his own stories in return, though given the tangled mess of memories bouncing around at his skull, it could get confusing very quickly. Ta-da! Said Nick, excitedly. The night guard had stopped suddenly, and Lancelot very nearly bumped into him. It was a nice-looking display. It depicted a grassy plain under an overcast sky. In the distance, there appeared to be a castle, and just off to the side, a dense forest. The tablet's magic had brought the painted backdrop to life, and the greenery swayed gently in the breeze. There was a familiarity to it, like the place he kept visiting in his dreams. "You simply wanted me to see one of the new displays?" Lancelot asked. "That was hardly necessary. I likely would have come across it on my own." Nick deflated a bit. "No, dude, look at the plaque. Knighthood in the Middle Ages and Chivalric Code, 8th to 15th century CE. Lancelot blinked. He'd had to reread it a couple times for it to fully sink in. "Knighthood and chivalry," he echoed, and Nick's grin returned. "Yeah, this is where you'll be during the daytime from now on." This was a wonderful honor. Lancelot never thought he'd get to have such a privilege, especially after his stunt in London. He'd always just been a suit of armor off in the corner. The spot in the rotunda was nice, and a little standee with some information about plate armor and its uses, but this was far more grand. "Am I?" Lancelot looked around the hall for a moment, searching for the other fellows clad in steel. There were none, at least not in sight. "Am I to be the only sculpture featured in this exhibit?" Nick chuckled a little awkwardly. No, there were supposed to be other guys, but they're... late. The place Dr. McPhee commissioned got a little backed up, something about one of the artists hurting their wrist. I'm not entirely sure. You know by now how Leslie gets when he's having an angry rant. Lancelot nodded. He'd only ever been scolded by Lord McPhee once, and it was very confusing. The knight had been left wondering if the man had been cursed to eternally have all his sentences fall short of completion. "But don't worry, they should be finished soon," Nick continued quickly. "I think the official estimate was like a week or two." "The time of their arrival should be the least of our worries. Our real concern should be their temperament," Lancelot mused. "If they're anything like myself when I awoke, you're sure to have your hands full." That comment was intended to be humorous, but Nick looked horrified at the prospect. "Ah, thank you, Sir Nick, for showing this to me, and allowing me to truly find a home in this grand museum," Lancelot said quickly. Yeah, Nick scratched the back of his head thoughtfully. "I gotta get back to Ak. You can, explore if you want." Nick left, his gait a little stiffer than it was moments ago. Lancelot turned back to the display, considering that he would no longer be the only knight gallivanting around anymore. What if they were like him? Not just in pomp and audacity, but what were the odds of seeing his family again? It made his heart ache a little. He knew one could not always be certain with the tablet. Not even its owner knew all its secrets. Yet he dared to hope. Humming, Lancelot shed his armor, placing it in a heap by the base of the display. The small incline in the middle of the grassy floor looked inviting, and Lancelot settled down against it. The grass was soft. If he turned his head towards the wall, he could smell the approaching rain. There wasn't much moonlight left tonight, certainly not enough for exploring, but he could spend it taking in the scenery from this cozy little spot. Tonight had started off rather glum. He'd wanted to be sad. This, however, was much nicer. Lancelot could only hope things would continue to look up.